Hey guys, today we're going to study totalitarianism and we're going to apply totalitarian examples to the countries of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Soviet Union. A good definition of totalitarianism would be that of a government controlling every aspect of the lives of its people. And these governments emerged during the 1920s and 1930s in the aforementioned countries. They were different than the traditional conservative authoritarian governments that existed prior to the 20th century. So, for example, traditional conservative governments would include the anti-democratic governments in Europe, Metternich, Bismarck, Catherine the Great, Louis XIV. And those governments really limited popular participation in government. You know, the landlords, the bureaucrats, high church officials generally favored the status quo, and those that were seen as liberal or subversive were more seen as radical, so to speak. And when all was said and done, conservative authoritarianism was really a movement at controlling the upper classes. In turn, monarchies would often give the upper classes good control over their peasants or the serfs, depending on which country it would be. That changed in the 20th century with the introduction of totalitarian governments. Totalitarian governments essentially operate on the premise that everything was in control by the government. And with that said, nothing was outside the control of the totalitarian state. Totalitarian governments were also different than traditional conservative governments in the fact that it was aimed at the masses. This is evidenced in the mass rallies you see in Nazi Germany or the May Day celebrations that took place in the Soviet Union as well. The methods included advanced use of technology, including the automobile. The automobile, or the Volkswagen in Nazi Germany, was created as a people's car, and it was meant to improve living conditions for the lower middle classes. Furthermore, the telephone was used, but most importantly, the radio. The radio allowed better communications, and another way in which 20th century dictators were different than their previous authoritative rulers was the fact that they were able to use better communication during this time period as a result of greater technology. As far as indoctrination, the dictators generally controlled the economic, the social, the intellectual, the cultural aspects of people's lives. Art, film, and so forth were run by the state. And essential to successful totalitarianism will be the use of terror tactics. The secret police, such as the Gestapo in Nazi Germany and the Cheka, later renamed the KGB in the Soviet Union, ensured strict compliance to the nation's laws. Some historians argue that the concept of totalitarianism emerged from World War I when individual liberties were subordinated by the total war effort. Lenin, in particular, showed how a dedicated minority, such as the Bolsheviks, could make a total effort over a less determined majority, and provided a model for single-party dictatorship. Mussolini, who legally was appointed prime minister by the Italian king, also provided a model for a single-party dictatorship, and within a few years of being appointed, other parties ceased to exist and were no longer allowed. Essentially, nothing was outside control of the state. Everything was for the state. And totalitarian governments had very strong centralized bureaucracies that were controlled by the one leader or party. With that said, characteristics of the governments, of the totalitarian governments of the 1920s. First off, as previously stated, there was one leader or party. In Germany, it was the Nazi Party. The leader was Adolf Hitler. In Italy, it was the Fascist Party. The leader was Benito Mussolini. And in the Soviet Union, it was the Communist Party. Lenin was the earliest leader, later Stalin. These were the only parties that were allowed in these countries. Furthermore, As stated earlier, this was based on the masses and relied heavily upon propaganda. Joseph Goebbels ran a very smooth propaganda machine in Nazi Germany that glorified Adolf Hitler as the savior of Germany. The same propaganda machine taught how Jews were subhuman and Slavs were subhuman, and the qualities of the Aryan race, which really didn't exist. They used film, posters, art, whatever was in their means that they could use, and basically established so-called cults of personality for their leader that portrayed the leaders as superhuman. In addition, these societies were very militaristic. In fact, Germany in particular, rebuilt its military in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles and became one of the strongest, if not the strongest, military in Europe by the outbreak of World War II. They also mobilized society towards a great goal. In Nazi Germany, the great goal was towards this idea of defying the Treaty of Versailles and recovering from the Great Depression, both of which the Nazi Party did quite successfully. In the Soviet Union, the great goal was industrialization during the 5-year plans, and the Soviet Union was able to do in about 10 years what it took the Western world to do in about 100, and that was to become an industrial society. Of course, the 5-year plans and collectivization led to great loss of life. A man-made famine in the Ukraine and opposition to collectivization led to the death of millions, and the emphasis on heavy industry led to a severe shortage of consumer goods. Overall, in these societies, individual rights disappear. Both Germany and Italy were functioning democracies when Mussolini and Hitler came to power. Yet in Germany, within a few short months after the burning of the Reichstag, the Enabling Acts set up a dictatorial government and rights disappeared. Italy took a little bit longer, but not much, and by the mid-1920s, Italy was a single-party state, with the Fascist Party being the only legal party. The Soviet Union, well, it was the Soviet Union. There really wasn't much as far as rights disappearing because they didn't have many rights to begin with. But which few rights they did have were controlled by the secret police, and it was not uncommon for political prisoners to be sent to the gulags in Siberia under Stalin's leadership as well. Of these big three, the least totalitarian would have been Fascist Italy, and so we're going to focus on the totalitarian governments of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. One last thing about fascist governments is that they focus on expansionist nationalism. You may recall that communists were more focused on worldwide revolution. However, the totalitarian regimes used nationalism when it was to their advantage, even in the communist Soviet Union. For example, during the Russian Civil War, they were able to effectively mobilize against the whites because of foreign aid coming into the whites, resulting in a red victory. Later on, the idea of socialism in one country, Stalin's plan to make the model communist country be the Soviet Union, contributed to this as well. However, the fascists really focused on this idea of expansion. The German policy of Lebensraum, or living space, which was spelled out in Mein Kampf, encouraged that the Germans needed to expand and to move eastward and to take over the fertile lands of the Soviet Union. Even the Italians focused on expansionist nationalism and wanted to develop an empire as symbolized by their conquering of Ethiopia in 1936 and their annexation of Albania in 1939. Next, I'd like to discuss the conditions that fostered the rise of totalitarian governments. One question that is puzzling is that why were the people of governments of Germany and Italy willing to give up their rights for these totalitarian regimes, especially in Germany? Probably the most important reason or cause of the rise of totalitarian regimes were unfavorable economic conditions. In the years following World War I, Italy suffered a post-war economic depression. There were numerous worker strikes, plus a number of people returning from the war who were unable to get jobs. This led to civil unrest, and Mussolini's black shirts went around basically as political thugs beating up communists and socialists uh, during this time period. But by doing this, they were able to get the support of the middle class who thought they could eliminate the threat of big labor and the threat of socialism. In the Soviet Union, economic conditions had been poor since prior to the Tsar and very limited rights. So as a result, it was a much easier transition to totalitarian rule in that country. As far as Nazi Germany, it had it had arisen due to the failure of the Weimar government. The Weimar government was the first attempt at German democracy, and unfortunately, by 1929, unfavorable economic conditions caused by the Great Depression led to unemployment rates as high as 43% in some areas, 43%, with some areas much higher. It's during these times that people and citizens would flock towards parties that were further to the right or further to the left, such as the fascist parties or Nazi parties that were on the right, and the Communist Party, which was on the left. In addition, especially regarding Germany and the Soviet Union, there was a lack of historic democratic conditions. As previously stated, the Weimar government was Germany's first attempt at a democracy, and unfortunately, the Weimar government was stained with the sin of accepting the Versailles Treaty. And so the 13 short years of German democracy didn't help stave off totalitarian rule. Once again, Russia had maybe 6 months of democracy during the provisional government of Kerensky, and even that democracy was very limited. And so this lack of historical democratic conditions makes it easier for a country to be ruled by totalitarian leaders. There's also the failure of the government to control the paramilitary. Many students do not understand what a paramilitary is, but it's a military organization that exists but is not a part of the state. So, for example, in our country, we have the U.S. military, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. But there are smaller military or paramilitary groups that exist that do not have the endorsement, nor are they recognized by our government. In the case of Italy and Germany, these groups were the black shirts and brown shirts, respectively. And like I said earlier, these groups acted as somewhat as political thugs going against their enemies. The brown shirts in Nazi Germany marched around and they used this visual support to show this great Germanness to them that was impressive to many people. And the government was really just simply unable to stop these paramilitary organizations from forming. By 1933, there were well over a million, if not more, members of the brown shirts, while there was only 100,000 regular people within the German army itself. As far as the Soviet Union, although there wasn't an official paramilitary for the Bolshevik Party, the Bolsheviks did control the Petrograd Soviet during the provisional government, and this Petrograd Soviet had quite a bit of influence over the government during that time period. Totalitarian regimes used an exaggerated sense of nationalism, especially in the fascist countries of Italy and Germany, which continues. But once again, as stated earlier, even the Soviets were forced to rely upon this exaggerated sense of nationalism, especially during the Russian Civil War when foreign troops were on their soil. And finally, fascists were able to play upon the fears of a communist takeover. This helped them to get the support of the middle classes, and with this support, they were able to further their own agenda while ensuring their rule. Finally, I'd like to point out the differences and similarities between communism and fascism. The similarities mostly lie in the methods used, and that both were totalitarian regimes. Whether the use of the secret police, the curtailment of basic civil rights, the fact that there was only one legal party, and all the other characteristics of the totalitarian regimes were used whether a communist regime or a fascist regime. And in fact, continued in other communist states in addition to the Soviet Union. For example, China practiced much of these same methods in the post-World War II period. The differences mainly lie in the ideology. Whereas communists may use nationalism to their advantage, they preach the idea of worldwide revolution and are much more international in scope. Whereas fascists really were highly nationalistic. The Germans promoted the idea of the master race and this Aryan race that would evolve, and the idea of Lebensraum, where they would expand. And even the Italians tried to pull upon the greatness of the Roman Empire in the Renaissance period and their own botched attempts at building up a strong military. Also, communist regimes generally abolish private property and ownership except on a small scale. Whereas fascists, private property and business exist, but usually under the government control. And so often the state may tell the private companies what to produce, but the private companies make the profits. And finally, the idea of the state. Once again, and these circles are a little bit backwards, communists, the state will disappear, whereas fascists tend to glorify the state. So disregard that on the bottom and reverse that last one. I did not realize that was so off there. Anyway, one last thing. We talk about the political spectrum before on the right and the left. And I'd like to point out that the political spectrum, instead of a line, can also be a circle. The far right would be the far fascist regimes here, as indicated by the line, whereas the far left would be the communist regimes, as indicated by the line there. With that said, once again, this kind of supports the idea of the circles that both fascism and communism were totalitarianism, but ideologically were different than the other. I'd like for you to complete this assignment in your notes. We've talked about things in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and there's other things that you read about. I'd like you to take a moment and, using the SPRITE method, remember SPRITE stands for social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, and economic characteristics. What are methods and actions used in Nazi Germany regarding those factors, and what were the same used in the Soviet Union? So, for example, the Soviet goal was a classless society socially, and one of the methods used were to seize all private property and to create collective farms where all was shared, and that was also part of the actions. In Nazi Germany, there were distinct social classes, and private property still existed, and so one of the social characteristics within Germany was there continued to be a class system, and in fact, those that benefited under the previous system continued to benefit as well. So take about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and go through your notes and fill in this graphic organizer with this. And if there's any questions, please email me, and I will try to answer them as best I can. Thank you.